Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Gaston Alonso. I am the director of the Ethel R. Wolf Institute for the Humanities at Brooklyn College. And I have been very excited for this event. Today we're celebrating Brooklyn College anthropology professor Hejtmanek's latest book, The Cult of CrossFit, Christianity, and the American Fitness Phenomenon. And so if we can please extend a round of virtual applause for Professor Hejtmanek. Congratulations on this fantastic and fascinating book. Now, this is the fifth in a 7-part series that the Wolf Institute is hosting this semester to celebrate recent books by Brooklyn College faculty. We have 2 more events coming up. Tomorrow, Tuesday, April 22nd at 12:30 at the Tanger Auditorium. We celebrate Jean Theoharis's latest book, King of the North, Martin Luther King Jr.'s Life of Struggle Outside the South. Again, that's tomorrow at 12:30 p.m. at the Tanger at the Brooklyn College Library. And then on Wednesday, April 30th, at 2:15 at the Tanger, we celebrate Professor Yoon-Jo Lee's book, Stories on Disabilities Through Our Voices, Born This Way. We invite you to join us for those events as well. You can learn more about them at the link that we'll be sharing in the chat. Also, to let you know that our recording of this event will be available at the Wolf Institute's YouTube channel, where you can find recordings actually of all of our events, and we'll be sharing that link as well. And now, let me take this opportunity to thank those of you who have joined us tonight, those of you who have joined us on previous events. Some of you are return customers, whether it's the online kind of happy hour intimate events that we do like this, or in our in-person campus events. Thank you so much for being part of these conversations celebrating my colleagues. And I want to tonight especially thank the students of the Brooklyn College Historical Society, who are once again joining us from campus, where they are hosting a Zoom watch party, bringing fun, food, and intellectual pursuits together. How fantastic is that? I gather you're going to be eating pizza while we're talking about CrossFit, and I just love that as someone who loves pizza. So thanks for joining us. 5 semesters ago, when we first imagined this new book series, we wanted to both honor the exceptional work that our colleagues at Brooklyn College are doing, and also to bring students and faculty and staff together to build community. And tonight's event, I think, just fills me with joy because it reminds me how the series has actually done that. We've been able to do what we wanted to do. And that's only because of the way that you all have responded to our vision. So thank you for being with us. And with that, let me introduce today's speakers. Katie Hejtmanek is professor of anthropology and children youth studies at Brooklyn College. As a psychological, cultural, and medical anthropologist, researching cultural processes of self-transformation and power, her research has taken her to, and I love this, a mental institution for children, strength sports collectives and teams, anti-aging clinics, and CrossFit gyms. In 2023, she published a co-edited volume, Gender and Power in Strength Sports, Strong as Feminist. And she just published the book that we celebrate today, The Cult of CrossFit. Oh, and she's also a national and world champion in masters weightlifting. Lauren Mancia is a professor of history at Brooklyn College and a professor of medieval studies at the Graduate Center. As a historian of medieval Christian devotional practices, she also organizes the late antique medieval early modern colloquium. Her first book, Emotional Monasticism, shed light on medieval monastic practices of effective piety. Her second book, Meditation and Prayer in the 11th and 12th Century Monastery, Struggling Towards God, 2023. And she's currently working on a third book, Embodied Epistemology as Rigorous Historical Method. Now, I got to tell you that last year we held an event both for Professor Hejtmanek's edited volume, Gender and Power in Strength Sports, and Professor Mancia's Meditation and Prayer. And those 2 events remain some of my very favorite in this series. So I've been looking forward to this event all semester Now, I'm going to turn the microphone over to them in a second. They're going to engage each other in conversation. And then at the end, we'll reserve time for questions and answers. At the same time, as they're speaking, if you have questions, if you have comments, put them in the chat, and they'll either try to address them as they speak, or we'll come back to those when we get to the question and answer at the very end. So once again, Professor Hejtmanek, congratulations on the book. Professor Mancia, thank you for joining us, and I turn the microphone over to you.
Amazing. Thank you so much to Gaston and to Kiana, and to all of you for coming. And thank you, Katie, for allowing a medievalist to interview you about something that happened in the present.
Can't wait for those questions. Thank you, Gaston and Kiana, for organizing everything. I know it is both a labor and a labor of love. So thank you so much for being so organized. And everybody, thank you for coming on the first day back from spring break. It's a lot, so appreciate you all showing up. And thank you, Lauren, for our long time together, being colleagues, both as program directors and as strength sports enthusiasts. And now I think we're going to pivot to some epistemological questions and some deep existential questions together in our work. And I'm excited for what happens with that today, as well as what that might bring later on.
Yes. All right, let's do it. So I'm going to ask Katie some questions about her book. She'll tell us a little bit about it, and then we're going to sort of start talking about its significance and what we should be doing as academics working on these kinds of things. So first, let's just put everybody on the same page. What is CrossFit? And can you explain how it transformed what exercise was and how you engaged in your research?
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to give you some dates, everyone. So in 2000, Greg Glassman, I don't have an image of him here, but I have him on the next slide. A self-identified libertarian college dropout turned personal trainer, had been kicked out of many mainstream gyms. He started training people in his garage, the quintessential location of American entrepreneurial capitalism. He defined what he was doing as, quote, constantly varied functional movement at high intensity, and named it CrossFit. He incorporated new kinds of activities that were not seen in the mainstream gyms. Mainstream gyms have a lot of what are called selectorized machines. You sit on them, you do leg press or knee extensions, hamstring curls. You get on an elliptical for an hour and watch a television show. Maybe you take a shower, sit in a sauna, and then you go home for the day. And that all did not have, he got kicked out of all these gyms because he was having people do barbell lifts and Olympic weightlifting lifts like the snatch and the clean and jerk. He had people powerlifting, deadlifts, squats, bench pressing. And then he put up sort of a quick, what he called metabolic conditioning. It's the timed event of the workout. And he had people moving around different kind of circuit style training. People got really hot, took off their shirts, wanted to use a lot of chalk, and he was playing some hardcore AC/DC in the background. And part of the reason was he got kicked out of mainstream gyms because of this sort of like roguish type behavior. But the idea of the fitness regimen, the constantly varied, had this idea that he could pick out of a bingo ball, what's called a hopper, and whatever that exercise was, he put it in the workout. Functional movement meant that it was something that the whole body used, like a squat or a deadlift, and that you had to do it really intensely, high intensity. The movements he prescribed, they were calisthenics, they were functional movements. He said that those were based on physics and evolution. He said that he was creating bodies that humans would have had 1 million years ago. And for my biological people in the back, humans went around 1 million years ago. But that's what he said on a 60 Minutes interview. In the early days of the World Wide Web, he created a website, and he posted workouts for free every single day. And this became known as the workout of the day, or WOD. this online website that people had the ability to post on it. And so it created the first online community of people interacting with one another about what their times were compared to anyone else who was using this free website. Every single day today, still for the last 24 years, people can get on the CrossFit website and get a free workout without paying CrossFit any kind of money. CrossFit it was the idea that in 2001, after 9/11, CrossFit became the go-to workout regimen for law enforcement and military personnel, especially those in the special forces. They were preparing for battlefields, both at home and abroad. In 2005, CrossFit started naming its most challenging workouts and its most famous workouts for soldiers who had died during the War on Terror. They called them hero WODs. In the US, CrossFit has since become linked to the US military, a popular fitness regimen predicated on a survivalist, militaristic approach, training gym goers as if they were Navy SEALs preparing for war or the apocalypse. A lot of fitness in the United States has been linked to war preparedness for the citizenry. In fact, maybe some of you remember the president's physical fitness like yearly you'd had to do the physical fitness exam, and you got a patch if you passed it. And so the physical fitness has oftentimes in the United States been linked to physical preparedness and the nation state. But CrossFit sort of doubled down on this by becoming linked to the military specifically, and then being a space for special forces more particularly. CrossFit also identified itself as, quote, the sport of fitness, known for the uber muscular bodies of the mostly white men and women who compete to be crowned the fittest man and woman on earth at the annual International CrossFit Games. CrossFit also considers itself a competition in the gyms. You work out really hard to beat the people who are in a class with you. CrossFit is designed as a class so it's an hour long, and it brought men to the CrossFit gym to do group fitness together, which is not a common practice. And it also brought women who are used to doing group fitness classes into a space where there was barbell and heavy lifting. So it sort of brought a new element of fitness to both men and women by putting all of those things in a class setting. In 2015, CBS's 60 Minutes labeled Glassman the king of CrossFit and showcased them for mainstream America. By 2017, CrossFit had 15,000 gyms in 162 of 195 countries, and about 500,000 people participated in the annual competition. It was the 7th fastest growing corporate chain in the world. CrossFit is a business, a brand, a fitness regimen, a community, a sport, a cult, the best hour of one's day, and a means of salvation. Sociologist Marcella Dawson calls CrossFit a reinventive institution, or something that encourages voluntary commitment to self-improvement, tapping into American values of hard work and moral goodness. Religion is often used as a framework to make sense of a commitment to a set of beliefs and practices linking moral goodness with hard work. Religion in the United States really means Christianity. So religion or cult or church or whatever is endlessly used to talk about CrossFit. It is because of the United States' Christian roots and legacies that seemingly offhanded remarks or images about CrossFit, such as these, make sense. Finding elements of Christianity in a supposedly secular practice of fitness illustrates how forms of Christianity become subtle, such as using Christ's birthday to mark time, whether that's AD or CE, or watching redemption stories in all of our Hollywood movies. Thinking about how Christianity continues to hold great influence over Americans, perhaps less in the churches and more in the gyms, is to shift it from a religious tradition or identity to cultural experience. And I call the expansive and often obscure legacies of Christianity in the CrossFit gym cultural Christianity. So Christianity in the United States is different today than it was in the 1600s, 1770s, 1840s, 1950s, and so on. Therefore, I use cultural historian and African-American studies scholar Saidiya Hartman's understanding of an afterlife to make sense of Christianity's morphing staying power. I use this understanding of afterlives to think about the way Christianity, entrenched centuries ago, has yet to be undone, leaving formally religious institutions and seemingly secular afterlives in the United States. These afterlives include calling CrossFit a religion and the various ways Christianity appears in the CrossFit stories, communities, capitalism, science, and preparations for the future. I also mentioned I was going to show a picture of Greg Glassman in this slide. He is the one in the San Francisco shirt, baseball shirt, in that Harvard Divinity School image. So I think I am interested in American culture as much as I am CrossFit. Indeed, I think CrossFit's success offers a window into the way American historical afterlives find purchase in the 21st century. So it might seem that exercise isn't that interesting or important or meaningful for anthropological study. There's anthropologists Nico Besnier, Susan Brownell, and Thomas Carter write that sport is easy to dismiss as an inconsequential aspect of our lives, or exercises often seem as a simple biological function. But I think that sport and exercise are avenues where power operates and people make meaning in their lives. And I wrote the Cult of CrossFit to support this claim. Therein, I examine how science, religion, capitalism, community, nationalism, imperialism, militarism, gender, race, and ideas about the future are mobilized by a fitness regimen. And I think CrossFit is a window into how Americans' culturally Christian histories and afterlives are lived out, getting built into our bodies one workout at a time.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to do something that is not necessarily the way that it is experienced in real time, but I'm interested, first of all, in how CrossFit, let's extract religion from these other phenomena that obviously made CrossFit, and just acknowledge the sort of things that you see in CrossFit that are causing this particular institution to develop, right? So you mentioned already 2001, the war on terror, the early stages of the internet. You sort of mentioned the sort of whiteness of the people in CrossFit. Can you talk a little bit about how it is a product of capitalism, white supremacy, the 2001 sort of era of history first, and then we're going to sort of dive deeper into religion.
So it started right in this guy's garage, and a couple of other people found it, and they wanted to build what's called an affiliate system, which means they kind of pay an annual fee and they can build their own CrossFit gym, which is very different than a franchise that takes millions or hundreds of thousands of dollars to create. And it sort of started, and so quickly, right, people were starting to build these gyms. And some of the first people who were doing it, this was in Santa Cruz, California, and this is like, Silicon Valley, this idea of the garage that is like the quintessential, this is where all the men are making these really cool new inventions and then bringing them to the masses. So Glassman kind of fits into that. And then because it was like this competitive kind of in your face, the workouts were really hard. He got a lot of people who were part of the law enforcement to come to his garage and train with him. And so quickly you started seeing it become like this white thing. And then with the US military and the war on terror, right, we pivoted, we just said it in a new way that the United States was now in a crusade against evil, which was the Islamic world. And so we were using our military to fight this. And a lot of people stepped out of their everyday lives, and enlisted and went, were in a nationalistic, patriotic form, sort of going to participate in this. And, quickly and sort of seemingly this became a very white, entrenched fitness regimen. Now, fitness in general is sort of a white woman endeavor, but CrossFit is like 86% white. But it also it's like 40% of its population has like a postgraduate degree, college education. And it's also very wealthy, like $150,000 annual income for a family. And that is sort of a elite white participation. It's like one of the first that was like this boutique fitness. So on the one hand, it has like this link to sort of working class roots, like the police and the military, and a college dropout, personal trainer, right? This idea that who was making this sort of, so it's got some of that root. And you'll find a lot of CrossFit gyms are veteran owned. But it was really expensive. I got grants to be able to do this research project, but it was almost 3 times as much as my regular, I had a Chelsea Piers Sports Center gym membership at the time, and it was $125, and I thought that was outrageous. But the average cost was $275 in 2016. And that is just kind of boutique fitness at its finest, because you're not going to get the televisions. You're not going to be able to go in whenever you want. You're not going to get a sauna or a steam room or even a shower. Maybe you're going to go to a class a few times a week, and it's going to cost you $275. So it has this really interesting sort of working class roots of it, but then it also has this elite whiteness in it. So it kind of mobilized within those sort of class dynamics, this idea of a whiteness that would permeate it. Granted, there are lots of people who do it that are not white, but the people who do it at the international level, almost all of them on the podium are white people, and a lot of them are Icelandic, so they're blonde and blue-eyed. A couple of the women are Australian. The men are mostly American, but they also so it has this militaristic, this sort of hyper masculinity. The men and the women are super buff and super muscled. And then it has mobilized kind of this white supremacist context to make sense of like what the fitness and what CrossFit is doing.
Well, I want to make the argument that were you just from the comfort of your own home analyzing CrossFit, that you would have been able to see all of those phenomena, that it would have been sort of obvious looking at pictures of people doing things, what the racial composition is, looking at stats, etc. But you didn't just analyze it from the comfort of your own home. What was your research methodology? And some of this is obvious as an anthropologist that you would be doing this, but explain for everybody what it is that you did, because it's actually pretty extreme.
I did what a lot of other anthropologists do, right? Oftentimes we go away to another country and we live there and we learn the language and we get to know, right, their times and their schedules and, right, just how life is like there. I didn't have to do that. I went into the gym and I started at 5 or whatever their first class was. And then I stayed there all morning. And then usually they might have a noon for people who are working, and then an afternoon and the evening classes. And so I stayed there the whole time. And a lot of the workers of the gym, if they didn't have a class, they'd be there working out. So I hung out even during that time. So I was sometimes there between 5 and 9 p.m. every day. And I did that every day. I didn't work out that much. I did a lot of observing of working out. I did do the workouts though. I had to put my body on the line to sort of feel what it was like. I went in as a track athlete. I had been racing for a track team in the 100 and 200 meters. And I had, in order to participate, I contacted some gyms, and the Brooklyn owner was like, yeah, you can come in for the workout. And so he wanted to assess my commitment to CrossFit by seeing if I could and how well I could do the workout. And so I did that and I participated. And I think that doing CrossFit is a really important element for understanding how it becomes so meaningful for people's lives. And that is sort of the psychological anthropology that I do, is I put my body on the line. I actually try to change it in the same kind of way that the people I have studied have. In the mental institution, I changed my emotional repertoires. Here, I sort of changed my body to sort of be able to do the kinds of workouts that CrossFit required. And then I did that every day in Brooklyn, and I had 2 gyms in Brooklyn and 1 in Manhattan that I spent a regular time with. And then I went to, anytime I traveled, visited my family for the summers, I would sign up for a CrossFit gym. If I went to a conference, I went to a CrossFit gym. And if I traveled internationally, I went to a CrossFit gym. So I have been to CrossFit gyms on 6 of the 7 continents. There is one on Antarctica at the American Research Station there. Its last post was Facebook postings in 2016, so I'm not sure if they're still doing it, but there is CrossFit boasts that there's one on every continent. And then I spent an extra 10 weeks in Delhi, India to study CrossFit there. And I was doing a pilot project in different countries, and I spent 10 weeks in India and 10 weeks in Melbourne, Australia. But I quickly realized that that was not, I couldn't use that as, I could use it as pilot research, but it really put into stark relief so much of the American things that I had been missing, even as I put my body on the line, because of some of the comments they would say, or because of the ways in which they didn't do all the American things that I had seen in the American CrossFit gyms that I was going to. And so, yes, it's sort of this transnational global brand, but it also takes on very interesting, I liken it to the congregational church, where the local context really gives the flavor of the congregational church and the CrossFit gym. Yes, it's associated with this larger brand, but the way in which people do it, and if it has any kind of, ability to like bring people in to pay that kind of money, it has to address the needs of the community. And so I was able to see how that worked in Morocco, in Peru, in India, in Australia, Hong Kong, France, etc.
Amazing. And so by doing it, and by doing it internationally, what was this American afterlife that Christianity seemed to have? How did you start seeing an afterlife of Christianity giving CrossFit meaning?
So, I mean, they are so overt about their cultiness and about their religion. I mean, you saw those, all those are New York Times, like that is so mainstream. It is, Harvard Divinity School brought Glassman to town to be like, how is this a religion? So like they do that, and people took it on. People take on, this idea that I'm a Kool-Aid drinker, I'm a culter, I'm a lifer. I have changed my whole life because of this workout regimen. And it's not just, and the way it becomes meaningful is that it's very painful and it's a lot of suffering, but you do that suffering and pain with a community. And so that kind of stuff, I didn't see that same kind of like really, right? And then in CrossFit gyms, one of the first articles I wrote about was like the zombie apocalypse, like this idea that everybody was training for the end times. And none of that, nobody was being saved anywhere else, and nobody was training for an apocalypse. They were training to like get fitter. In India, there was all this other fitness activity that was happening at the same time. So 5Ks and marathons and new mainstream gyms were kind of popping up all over the place, and vitamin shops and supplement shops. So it was like the landscape was just kind of everything, everywhere, all at once fitness. And so CrossFit was just one of those things. And so people would come and then they'd go and they'd play rugby, or they'd go and they run a 5K. And so it wasn't like it wasn't their whole world. And then in Australia, they're very, very good at CrossFit and at sports. And so they sort of understood it as a sport. And so they just were like, they trained it as a sport. They thought of it as a sport. They told me explicitly, we don't do that military stuff. All of that's really weird. And like, we just try to get better at this, either for our other sports or to be like to compete well at CrossFit. And so both of those things really kind of had me really thinking about the devotion to CrossFit that I kept seeing in the American CrossFit gyms. And then I pulled on that thread, and then I just like kept unraveling it. So I started with the easy stuff, them pronouncing to the world that they're a cult and that they drink the Kool-Aid. And then I saw it, through the garage space and this idea of manifest destiny and particular kinds of, different other kinds of things that sort of unraveled as I pulled on that.
So this is so fascinating. So you're talking about salvation rhetoric, obsession with the end times, a devotion to sort of a congregation or a cultish kind of thing. How is that all not just what Max Weber described as like the Protestant ethic, right? Lots of people think about the American dream as being informed by this like redemption narrative, anxiety about salvation, working all the time, and to have that be the undercurrent of Christianity. How is what you're saying a little different?
So I think the Weberian stuff kind of comes from Western Europe. And so it has a lot of implicit assumptions about like, you're not trying to be saved, you're already saved. You're maybe trying to present that to the world as if everybody else thinks you're saved. And in the American version, so I spent a lot of time with New Thought theology, which is a very particular rendition of a Christian plotline. And everybody knows New Thought theology in our current like positive psychology speak. So anything where this idea that if you just think hard enough or put it out into the universe, if you think good thoughts, you can change your life. That is not positive psychology. That actually comes from the late 1800s in a new kind of Christianity that was created in the United States in the late 1800s. And it was associated with women, and it was associated with early people who did fitness regimens. So a lot of like our historical fitness people, Bernard McFadden, if you know him, or Eugene Sandow, they all were sort of identified. They all believed that if they focused on their body and their health and their fitness, and they prepared their body as a vessel for pureness and goodness, that was a way to heal themselves and be closer to God. And so it was this very, very particular kind of Christianity in the United States that linked physical fitness and physical practice with this idea that you are in conversation at that level with God, right? That's a very American evangelical, your own personal relationship with God. And then muscular Christianity was sort of like the masculine version to that feminine New Thought theology that was like linking ideas of sport and fitness. That's where the YMCA comes from. That's where a lot of the imperialistic Christianity of the United States and of England come through, the muscular Christianity movements that put sport, soccer notably, rugby, cricket, into their colonial practices to win over indigenous populations with this idea of a robust, right, body for Christ. And so that kind of this idea that that's where you could locate your relationship as well as like your lived experience of goodness and morality, I think is a very different version of Christianity than the Weberian one.
Awesome. How did you feel? This is, I didn't anticipate asking you this question, but I'm motivated to. How did you feel sort of stumbling upon Christianity as the thing you were starting to investigate, right? My sort of understanding is that you enter into this gym and you're like, I'm gonna figure out what's going on here. And it could very well have been a book about gender or a book about capitalism or whatever. Can you talk to us a little bit about the process of discovering that it was religion and how you felt about that as a scholar?
So I'm totally not a scholar of religion or an anthropologist of religion. And I was very nervous about writing a book about Christianity because I know a number of you, I see a lot of my pastor friends in the audience, and they know this from, right? I'm not a theologian. I don't study the history of Christianity. So I felt like I'm out of my depth. So I was very nervous to sort of, kind of do that and take that on. But I thought that like it just was, with everybody pivoting, it just made so much sense with how the practice unfolded, both at like this, at the high level and at like the local individual levels. And so I couldn't really get out of it, even though I kind of, was like, so I like reached out for support to make sure I was interpreting things correctly. And I got theological questions and answers from people who are, we did that faculty day group, Christianity and in weird places or something like this. And so sociology of religion, medieval historian, philosopher, right? So I was able to sort of bounce some of these ideas off of y'all, and you were like, yeah.
Yeah.
So that was helpful. And then I also had like a Christianity, who's a classicist of Eastern Christianity. So I talked to him a lot about all this stuff because he also knows CrossFit, and he's not an American. And so we spent a lot of time kind of talking about it as well. But the compulsion, the devotion people felt to it, I think you don't, I think that after I found sort of this pull of Christianity, this thread, I saw it, my mind's eye is that I see it undergirding all of the other things. And so the white supremacy is undergirded by settler Christian colonialism. The patriarchalness, the hypermasculinity is actually because of American Christian values. It's these evangelical, very mainstream Protestant white Christian, values that are supporting a lot of the New Thought theology was part of the early eugenics movement. So all of that, it's like I couldn't quite get outside of it because I actually think that some of the reason those other things are so entrenched is because it has such existential value in the Christian undergirding of and in the Christian afterlives of the United States when we like to say that we're a secular country.
Amazing. As a pre-modernist, I feel moved to say that like this is what happens when you put Christianity in the modern world next to all these other forces, right? And that the earliest versions of Christianity maybe weren't patriarchal, capitalistic, white supremacist, etc. But this is what they become in modernity's hands. No, I'm just kidding. But
Yeah.
so why are we talking together, right? Somebody who studies the pre-modern study, someone who studies the sort of contemporary, I think that in hearing about your project as you were working on it, I was incredibly moved that someone else, right, was out there seeing the world and understanding actually that Christianity was the key to unlocking how it is that our culture is working. I was moved by that. And I find that like that kind of focus in my own work and my own teaching sort of makes a lot of sense to me. But I also think when I sat down to read your book, I was moved by the way in which you were gently criticizing the academy for thinking about physical embodiment as sort of simple, biological, not serious, etc. And I think that embodiment is meaningful. And I think that as scholars, I have come to realize as an older scholar, right, who is farther away from graduate school and from the gaze of my mentors and my super egos in the academy, right, I've come to realize that physical embodiment is key, and that as scholars, so often we just pretend we don't have a body and that we're just the brain, really, doing all of this work. And so, can you talk a little bit more about how embodiment is essential for understanding how power or spirituality or culture work? Your earlier project was embodied in that it was participant observation, but potentially less embodied than this one, where you were literally transforming the muscles of your body. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I tried. So when I actually put myself in a mental institution for a year and a half for my first work in front of, and there's actually somebody here who was bore witness to that. And so I tried to like live this sort of confined life, and this idea of how can we get out of how do we change who we are in order to prove that we are healed or something like this. I didn't obviously have to do that. It was but I tried to live as closely as that to sort of get this sense of like what it is to heal in these psychiatric conceptualizations for these mostly Black men and women who lived in this institution, especially when they can prove all they want that they're healed, but the system is rigged against them. And so I have always been, as a person who is very much a kinesthetic person, I understand the world by moving through it, like less of an auditory or a visual. I'm a mover. Have me do it and I get it. And so I believe that that's a really important way to understand the world. And I think that there's some really great anthropology that's like, yeah, we will sit around and talk about the like food of it, the beer of it, the drink of it, the like conversation of it, but we spend so much of our time moving with people, walking with people, like, living in the like moving, and then we don't kind of recognize that as a really important element of what it means to be human. And of course, despite different abilities, one of the key frameworks that my bio folks would say is what makes us human is our biological ability to walk long distances and to move in the world bipedally, and to dance and jump. Right? We have actual like ways in which our head moves and our limbs move that where dancing is also really important. And I think that what happened is, and I think part of the Enlightenment in our like heavily Christian world, it was this idea that the body is a feminine, maybe less Christian place to be, and that if we think and we, are outside of that corruptible space, then we can become purer in our thoughts and more rigorous in our science. And I think that like all of that, even I kind of take on a little bit of psychology as a very Christian discipline in the United States, because a lot of our early psychologists, even our contemporary psychologists, a lot of our early psychologists were all seminary dropouts, seminary graduates, sons of pastors, right? They made the self from the soul, which was just kind of secularizing this very Christian notion as of an internal right space. And so I think that like we have to kind of critique some of our own scientific endeavors to be able to actually understand the way the world works. And if we look at, right, some indigenous scholarship or African American scholarship, or we look at, right, questions around ability, we sort of can pick at some of these really entrenched understandings about one way of being in the world that has really been the byproduct and the focus and legacy of like mostly a particular group of white men in the world, as Christian imperialism sort of took over the other kinds of sciences during colonial endeavors.
That's so interesting. I hadn't even thought about how Christianity is also potentially the cause or the Enlightenment's reaction to that cause, right? For the academy being the way that it is, sort of hyper focused on the intellect. That's super interesting. So I also think that a way that you and I are similar in what we study is that we're both really interested in why people feel intense devotion to something other than themselves, and how that intense feeling then reflects back on the cultural moment that they live in. And so you call this psychological anthropology, not physiological, psychological anthropology, right? And I call it the study of effective devotional practice, but it's the same thing. Can you talk a little bit about just what, so I imagine you always were interested in that as a graduate student, as a before graduate student. Can you talk about the evolution of that interest over your career, how it's sort of manifest in this book, and then how this book might be motivating you to do something else in this particular area, this sort of interest in devotion or whatever?
So I think that part of it was that I don't consider myself a joiner. And so this idea that people would be really devoted to this practice was really lost on me. And I really was concerned that I wasn't going to get it because I didn't feel that. Then the other part of me as an anthropologist is that that's being too close, right? That's like studying something that you can't actually get right distance from. You can't be a participant observer. You're like just a participant. And so I like kind of played with that a little bit. And I think the psycanthro part is that I'm interested in the boundary between where self ends and culture begins and where culture ends and self begins. This idea of like what makes us who we are. And we think that culture gets inside here. Like I am built up by cultural frameworks. And you can change those if you're thoughtful enough and move differently and like engage in the world in a different kind of way. You can kind of transform your own embodied experience and cultural sort of composition. I think that's possible. So I'm not really looking to pinpoint exactly where that ends, but I'm interested in that kind of conversation because I study culture not necessarily just in sort of architecture or right television or other kinds of things that are out there. It's like here. And then I think that when that happens, especially for the group that I was studying, that transformation of that physicality was something that dramatically changed people's lives. And they talked about it as being saved. And I like couldn't, and I actually, in my introduction, I say part of what I sort of create a little bit of ethnographic authority by saying, I dedicated 7 years of my life to this practice. I wanted to understand it. I traveled around the world. I was committed to doing it, but it didn't save me. And so who I am as a person was not sort of at stake. And so I could maybe critique it a little bit more. And I think that's really important because a lot of academics, as well as non-academics who study CrossFit and write about CrossFit, started in CrossFit and then wrote about it. They started in their like whatever their little physical practice was and then wrote about it. And I didn't. I went to CrossFit to study it as an anthropologist. And I think that really is what makes my work different and where I can analyze it in a little bit different kind of way because I don't have this, my existential experience, my journey, my self-discovery or whatever is not attached to this physical practice, but that I could see that that's what happened to people. And so I tried to do it justice in the way that I could by committing to it in ways that I could. by changing other kinds of things.
Amazing, amazing. And I think also that, I mean, I'm just like seeing the names of various professors from various departments at Brooklyn College on the Zoom here. And I think that there's a way in which all of us probably are interested in this in one moment and another. If we're a literature professor, maybe in studying a novel or a poem. If we're a sociologist, maybe sort of in ethnography and participant observation also, right? But I think that like that is in some ways at the core of what people in the humanities and social sciences study, and even in business maybe study, right? And you just expressed it so beautifully. I wrote it down for my future reference. So we already have questions in the chat. Before we get to them, I just want to ask you one final question, which is, I think that scholarship that's interested in looking at this undercurrent of Christianity in American culture, scholarship that's interested in physical embodiment in a world where we're increasingly online and where AI is sort of threatening to do all kinds of things, right? And scholarship that is interested in the line between self and culture in 2025, in my opinion, is more urgent than it's ever been. And I'm interested in whether you feel that urgency, or whether it's just in my head, and also in whether or not this is going to dictate, where you go from here or how you are publicizing or talking about this research in public fora, right? Not just in the academy, but to the world, as it were. Whether there are sort of like big lessons that we can take in Trump's America, in Gen AI America, in the world of 2025?
I know when you gave me this question, I was a little concerned. Because I mean, I think part of what is really important for me is just the legacies of some of the things that have gone before.
Yeah.
And that, we see, there's like an upsurge in some of the more overt Christianity that's out there in the world, in the United States more generally, this kind of doubling down on a particular kind of unchristlike Christianity that is really violent, that has its roots in right settler Christian colonialism, less Christ-like life and early Christian narratives and experiences. And so I think that we need to like really think about the afterlife of this kind of stuff. And especially, and then on that note, like when I kind of critique some of the academy and psychology and disciplines, like I think that part of what we are going to see that play itself out in the generative AI stuff. That stuff is not pure outside of this sort of legacy. And so we already see it being like, unable to recognize non-white stuff. Like it's just so inherently racist that it's got, right? And it's being generated by a particular kind of people, and, destroying the earth and, energy extraction. Like it's just sort of like doubling down on some of this stuff without being critical and thoughtful about, right, that we aren't just sort of the language that we can create in a little bubble on ChatGPT. That some of our experiences are so much more about an embodied experience, and that we have to think about sort of these afterlives of all of these things that are continuing to prop up so much of our world, even and especially when we don't think that they are. Like we have to be a little bit more clear about that trajectory. And, we really like to say that we're a secular nation, and we like to see, some of this evangelical, right? There was a Times article where the evangelicals were praying with Trump in the White House regularly. Like that's where we're locating Christianity as like this thing that's like, something that we can like religious tradition sort of like check or whatever, rather than that this sort of violent Christianity that's sort of the grounds of the American nation state and American culture is like the bulldozer of a lot of what we do in the world today.
Yeah, amazing. And I also feel like in some ways, what if we see CrossFit for all of its positive qualities, right? That it is empowering men to work out in community and women to work out, with power and strength, right? That it is creating a kind of congregation, right? A kind of cult, we could say, but also a community that really people are deeply in, physically in, and not in a virtual sense, in really many ways, you know?
Yes. Mhm.
Like that it is in some ways a very retro, even though it's a product of the 21st century, it's also like hearkening back to these really retro things that Christianity does, right? Or that religion does, or that community does, whatever it is we want to say. And so in a way, your book, one of the things I love about your book is that you end the book not quite sure how you feel, how you, Katie, feel about CrossFit. It isn't like tearing CrossFit apart, and it isn't like adulating CrossFit and praising it, right? You really sort of toe that ambiguous line. And I ended sort of like confused about where you stood, but then I realized that that was actually a delicious sort of anthropological perspective that allowed me to think about how I was feeling while I was navigating all of the things you were showing me. And so I think that that ambiguity maybe serves you well, serves one well, in thinking about it as a critique of culture, that it is both a warning that Christianity is this undercurrent and that we need to sort of pay attention to that undercurrent. But it's also a sort of highlighting of things that we need in this 21st century world, like community, and physicality, perhaps,
Mhm.
embodiment. I don't know if you feel that way about those
Mhm.
things, but that's how I felt reading it.
That was purposeful, to sort of leave it so that I kind of outlined it. This is the show rather than tell of the ethnographic genre. And maybe people know because I say at the beginning it didn't save me. And I was told by somebody that I'm really hard on Glassman, but I don't quite take him down. Hopefully folks do that themselves, and sort of, but also, right, he's a very ambivalent, conflictual character for a lot of people. And I think CrossFit is as well. There's a lot of, the brand, it's one thing, and the local community is another. And I think that's also something that we can talk about Christianity wise as this really important thing that is meaningful in people's lives, and also is used sometimes as a cudgel, sometimes to make people feel badly about themselves, and sometimes it's like inaccurately described and taken to mean things that it shouldn't mean. And so I think that that's part of the job of an anthropologist, to sort of bring you to the water, and take a drink if you want to, but also that this is how people live. This is how people dedicate themselves. And I think we need to honor that as a reality. And what can we get from that? And if we do want to disrupt it, that we now have better tools to do that. And that was my goal, is that by looking at this idea of cultural Christianity, we might have another tool in our toolkit to be able to chip away at some of these other institutional oppressive systems that are undergirded by Christianity in new ways, because we actually see a deeper part of the root that needs to be excised and to be revised, so that actually some of the early traditions of of the anti-oppressive Christ and Christian church, or Jesus Christ himself, can be mobilized in different kinds of ways.
Thanks for that final shout out to the early traditions. I appreciate it. All right. We already have questions in the chat. Gaston, do I pass the baton to you now to moderate our Q&A?
If you want, but you're doing a wonderful job of it. But if you want, I can start with the questions in the chat. But please, if you are, especially the historical society students who are joining us, if you have questions, please either raise your hands or put them in the chat. But I'll move through the questions as they were asked in the chat while everybody else thinks about what to ask. So Bobby asks, with the passing of Pope Francis, what does this book mean now at the moment?
Surprise! No.
And also right after Easter.
True. I think that Pope Francis none of us is a scholar on Pope Francis. And I think that he was definitively not an American Christian. He's from Argentina. He's sort of in charge of world Christianity as the Pope. And so in some ways, we can learn from his example as a counterexample or as an example of a different kind of Christianity, as an alternative to the sort of American Christianity that I think Katie is talking about in her book. I don't know if you would agree with that, Katie.
Yeah, I think some of the Christianity I was talking about too kind of is like this prosperity gospel and like this linking of power to the church, and that's okay, right? And I think Pope Francis was like not okay with that. He was much more about, the poor, the oppressed, not in everything, right? But in ways that I think that the Catholic Church as he was what was he was a what was his denomination, Nicole? I feel like you might know this.
Liberation theology.
He was a liberation theologist, but then he was a
Jesuit.
Franciscan.
Yes,
Thank you, Lisa.
Franciscan.
Right. He was like with this idea of like particular kinds of inclusivity and poor and anti-oppression. I mean, he called so I think that is definitely not in the same vein as the particular kind of Christianity in the United States I'm thinking of. He was a Jesuit. That's right. That's what I was looking for. He was a Jesuit, right? Which has different kinds of settler Christian colonial legacies, right? Of Latin America and South America. But I didn't know either. But it was, right. So I think that was a huge piece of like the idea of recognizing, and not about getting wealthy and the American version for sure.
I think the next two questions in the chat kind of bring us to the American version. Nicole asks, I'm wondering where Christian purity culture fueled or didn't the rise of CrossFit. It is trying to perfect your body, a way of making it more pure. If so, is that also related to white supremacy culture? Absolutely.
This is Nicole and I go way back, so pastor in the United Church of Christ tradition. This idea that New Thought theology is this idea of purification of the body, and it was mobilized by white supremacy. It was like some of the first fittest contests, right? We have this idea of the fittest on earth as these fitness sport stuff. There used to be fittest families, et cetera, and it was like this idea of like posing, muscles, bodies, families always were in the eugenics movement. And so this idea of purifying your body through diet, exercise, Bernard McFadden never wore shoes, right? We know that that's come back, right? This idea of walking barefoot or barefoot shoes. So all of those definitely have their roots in New Thought theology, which was very much a white supremacist purifying of the body kind of practice.
Lauren, any responses from your perspective?
Oh, no. I mean, all I keep seeing is like, I think the idea of what a body is, what perfect is, all of this stuff is so different in the pre-modern world than what we would expect it to be. And so my perspective is just take a class on pre-modern Christianity with Professor Sowers or Professor Stern or me and Professor Schwabel, right? Learn about this alternative to these ideas that are then in New Thought theology, new theology, new Christian.
New Thought theology. It's like it's kind of related to Christian Science. It's like the pre-Christian Science of that. So it's a kind of a version of that where, right, Christian scientists don't go to the doctor because through prayer, they can heal themselves.
That's why I love bringing Lauren and Katie together. Right. The next question says, what CrossFit facility did you study in Manhattan? Curious, as I designed one in Manhattan in the mid-2010s, architect here, and I didn't know the Christian ties, perhaps because that particular gym was founded by a Jewish family. Is there any sort of connection to other religions, or is the fanatism only tied to Christianity, or is it veiled in a way that relates generally to others of other faiths? Does it translate any, or is it only a Christian thing, like it is only a uniquely American thing?
So excellent question. First of all, I don't give the names of the CrossFit gyms that I went to. So I don't say that in the book or anywhere else. But a lot of people, when I did a survey and a questionnaire, and I asked people if they were what a religion they identified with. And in my New York gyms, no, like people might, I think I got a couple of a secular Jew in the response, but other than that, no one identified as a Christian or nobody identified it as anything else. And so I don't think that in the United States, I think that it's kind of like other ways that cultural Christianity operates. It's like our calendar, like our Gregorian calendar, right, is a Pope Gregory calendar. All of, like just the very sort of ways in which we live in the world are, if you're not Christian and you weren't raised Christian, you might be able to see them more explicitly as the hegemony of the Christianity in the United States. But otherwise, right, I think that it's just chronically in some of our, I sort of, it's like the air we breathe. And so it moves people who weren't even Christian or people who identified as secular Jew. And then that was very different. So the gym in Brooklyn was very different than I went to a couple of places that were in the Deep South near army bases where a lot of people were from, right, the army or the DOD, and that were very Christian, evangelical Christian, and there were very specific Christian CrossFit stuff. So I sort of try to tease apart that idea that it's just like the actual Christian CrossFit stuff, and then this sort of Christian, cultural Christianity stuff that just kind of, it's just so easy for, we sort of can't even see it anymore because it's not as, sort of, we're not as aware of it. And I saw that right in the one in India, there was a Shiva on the wall. So, they might mobilize other kinds of religious traditions, but there I didn't necessarily see some of this fanatical devotional stuff that's Christianity. And I think the next question sort of lines up with that. I don't think that people, like I had a person I asked to describe a pain cave that they went through, that like this idea of a pain cave is a metaphor for experiencing really intense pain in the CrossFit gym or CrossFit workout. And I had everybody sort of tell me these things, and a lot of them, it's had very similar themes. But one person was like, I like go deep, and it's really hot, and it's like hell, and there's all these wooden doors that I have to go through, and then I like go through the belly of the beast, and then I like, if I keep going, I rise up on the mountaintop surrounded by clouds, and I've made it. And I was like, oh, where did you get those? Oh, are you Christian? She was like, no, what do you mean? Like, had no idea that she sort of mobilized some Dante Inferno stuff, and sort of all this like Jesus telling of the story of Jonah in the New Testament from the Old Testament, like none of that. And I asked her if she was raised Christian, and she said, like she kind of was. She went to Bible camp with a friend, but she started going to CrossFit at age 9 regularly, 5 days a week. And so she was raised in the CrossFit gym and sort of understood these sorts of images and understandings of like pain and like experiencing pain as this travel through through hell and death and resurrection, and like didn't make the connection with Christianity. And so I asked about, and I think like like this idea, like I think a lot of people are sort of concerned, like some of the non-Christian CrossFits are like, oh, that's not about us because we don't do Christianity, because it says Christianity on the title. And so I think that there's a little bit of some pushback and some confusion that how did I get to Christianity if I was looking at the zombie apocalypse in Brooklyn, where the zombie apocalypse is based on Christian apocalypticism, particularly, right, the dispensational premillennialism, which emerged in the United States from an Irishman, but in the late 1800s, as this sort of like secularization. And that is a particular kind of violent apocalypse, which that's not always the case. Post-millennialism is kind of a peaceful, 1,000 years of peaceful prosperity for people on Earth. But we don't think about the apocalypse like that anymore. It changed through sermons in the United States.
Fascinating indeed. Lauren, you want to jump in?
Well, I wonder if, I'm just thinking about Lloyd's question, right? I wonder if CrossFitters, though, would say, oh, yeah, but it's an American thing. Like, would they identify the sport as American, even though they wouldn't identify it as Christian?
Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah.
And so I take a little bit up, like, I feel like that is code, right? American is often code for white. It's often, and I think it's code in a lot of psychologies, people will talk about the American self or the American psyche or all of this kind of stuff. And all of that is sort of predicated on a particular kind of, right, Christian tradition that is been obscured and buried. So that's the afterlife. American actually means a particular kind of, right, Christian embeddedness that we have forgotten about or we think is secular now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so we also, just again thinking about the rhetoric that is around us, right? We think about like back to the Gregorian calendar, we think about like when Eid was a holiday that we celebrated in the CUNY calendar just this year, right? And the students had to petition for it, right? And if we think about like, who is thought to be an embodied person in America and who is not, which genders, which races, which people, right? These are like American ideas, but they are sort of fundamentally Christian ideas. So that even if you are a Jewish family, if you are American, you might be sort of partaking in that culture. Just to further clarify your points.
Yeah.
We have another question from Bobby, which is one actually that I was thinking about, and I'm going to add to it. Bobby is wondering what made you decide to research this topic, and I'm wondering what has sort of surprised you about the kind of reception of your work on this topic.
So I had a colleague who told me I should do the track and field that I was doing as a hobby, and I didn't think that was very interesting. And so I kept seeing all these new t-shirts that said strong is the new skinny and strong is the new sexy. And then I saw these mannequins in some of the stores that had the female mannequins had muscles. And I was like, as someone who's sort of been an athlete and, kind of had some girth to her, some muscles to her, I thought that was really interesting because that is not the fitness body that I had been like enculturated in. And so I started with strength sports. I started in a couple of months. I started with weightlifting, Olympic weightlifting, powerlifting, strongman, which is like the pulling of the big cars and the stones and the tires, and then CrossFit. And I quickly saw that my experience was that weightlifting, strongman, and powerlifting were more sports focused. They didn't have this whole life transformation that CrossFit had. And fitness, I think, has also, like CrossFit has kind of transformed the fitness landscape. Now you can go to any gym, any mainstream gym, and see a functional fitness space. We are good now. The United States is good at Olympic weightlifting because our good athletes were raised in CrossFit gyms. Women are using barbells and getting stronger, and that has been some part of the push to body positivity and anti-fatness, right? So this idea that you want to be strong and not skinny was a really kind of interesting thing to me. And this idea of a fitness journey, right? That I think is like an interesting way to think about it. I don't think about my fitness as a journey, but I think that was a really interesting part of the CrossFit. I think that's some of this sort of like resurrection, like Christian sort of element too, that you're going to go through this transformative process, has its links in some of this sort of resurrection time. So that's kind of how I got into it. And then I just threw myself into CrossFit specifically to sort of kind of pull at those interesting pieces. In 2016, so I did it for about 7 years, really intensely physically for a couple of years, and then I traveled internationally, and then I finished after 3 years, and then I continued to sort of watch it, and then lots happened in 2020 with the pandemic when the apocalypse was here, and that was not the apocalypse the CrossFitters trained for. So,
yeah. Go ahead, Gaston.
No, Lauren, please.
Well, I'm also, as you're talking, Katie, I'm thinking about yoga as it's practiced in the United States. And I'm thinking about how because there is a philosophical aspect often to yoga about like letting go, and that there is this philosophy and a self-improvement narrative, but it's never a narrative about salvation or redemption, right? Or apocalypse, like these, or pain, right? The relationship with pain in yoga and what hurts, right? It's very like, don't push yourself. You are where you are today, right? And that is exercise science or whatever that is undergirded by Buddhism, right? And so you can see actually in the contrast there that you have two very different, one un-American and one American, right? Cultural things. However, it would be fascinating to see like yoga practiced at American gyms, right? As opposed to by yoga practitioner, like taught yoga teachers who were trained in India or something, right? It would be interesting to see how the salvation rhetoric, whether it comes in or not. Lloyd has more questions, and Melissa had a comment.
Melissa, Lauren, I'm thinking you need to go to the yoga and do the yoga version of this book. All right. Melissa said, someone new at my gym that is part CrossFit sent an email to owners that they liked us because we didn't do as much of, quote, the U.S. imperialism war stuff.
Since 2000, Glassman, the owner, he had to sell his company. And it was, and part of his rhetoric and part of his capitalism was that he did an affiliate system, which was non-rent extraction. So it was like not your shareholder private equity. And that he had a moral authority and sacred covenant to all of those gyms to not rent extract from them. And then it got sold to private equity. And then in 2023, they jacked up the prices and did more rent extracting. And so part of CrossFit since 2020 and how I end the book is sort of this like mellowing out of CrossFit since 2020. That is like sort of, we all are a little bit more mortal post-pandemic. We have ended our war on terror missions. There is like a different kind of situation in both CrossFit and the United States in different kinds of ways. But I think that like that also is part of like if you joined CrossFit in the last 4 years, you might have seen less of this because there was this transition that happened in June of 2020 that I talk extensively about in the book. Yeah.
Thanks for that clarification. We have 1 minute left, and there are 3 questions. So I think the first to kind of touch on the kind of ambiguity that you talked about that ends the book. So I'm just going to take the last question, which says, did CrossFit influence the salvation rhetoric elsewhere in sports culture, which exists too?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of this muscular Christianity. And it's almost more explicit in other cult, like people will thank, God or Jesus for scoring a touchdown or winning a game or something, right? And CrossFitters do that if there's like very specific Christian CrossFitters who will, right, thank God at the end of a workout if they won. And so I think that's part of this is this muscular Christianity influence. And so, yeah, a lot of it is, right. And so I think that's part of the explicit Christian influence that we can all see and sort of pinpoint and point to. But I was more interested in some of this like undercurrent stuff when people were like, I'm not Christian, or I'm not religious, or I don't believe in that stuff, or I'm progressive. And they didn't have these sort of imperialistic views, or they were kind of ambivalent about the war on terror because they may have not come from this country, or right. And they sort of like but then they still sort of like continued and felt saved by this. And so I feel like that's part of the way Christianity, cultural Christianity operates. It's less identity to select, less religious tradition, and more a cultural experience. And I think we can find it so many places, even and especially at the CrossFit gym, but in so many, right? I encourage everyone to kind of keep an eye out for how this operates so many places in your lives.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for this book. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for, bringing us to the water, as you put it, right? Thank you for, asking us to ask these important questions about not only about how we study what we study, but also how we move in the world. So thank you so much for that. And Lauren, thank you so much for kind of walking us through it and kind of teasing out these important themes, right? Both about kind of the methodological questions, but also the sort of central themes of the study. So thank you so much and everybody else, thank you so much for joining us, for helping us sort of build community by learning together. Hope to see you at the next 2 book events, tomorrow and next Wednesday. But again, thanks so much to Katie and to Lauren for leading us in conversation today. Thank you.
And thank you so much for all the excellent questions, everybody. Really kind of pushing the conversation. Appreciate that very much. Thank you for coming and sharing your evening with us.